morning. This is the Blaine's World podcast that can be found each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And you can also get information about this show and other previous shows on our website, www.blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And to that end, it's my pleasure to introduce Erin Hallagan Clare, founder and artistic director at Parlor here in Asheville. And Erin, you can feel free to wave to all your fans and friends who are watching this.
Okay. Hi, thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. That's Erin. And Erin is founder and artistic director of Parlor, a community-driven art space celebrating story in all forms. She's a writer, storyteller, and creativity coach, where she teaches creativity and personal mythology workshops, along with hosting a weekly radio show on WPVM dedicated to Asheville's art scene. And the name of that show is what?
Story Parlor Hour.
Story Parlor Hour. And Erin has shared stories at the Moth, Listen to This, Testify, One Page Salon, and Story Department. She's a Moth Story Slam champion, and her reading can be found in Psychology Today, Thrive Global, and other publications, and she's a contributing author to the Coach's Guide to Completing Creative Work, published by Root Edge. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay. And now, Erin, you can add to that impressive background your guest on the Blaine's World podcast. So Yay! We can add that right to it. Erin, the question I always ask the first time when I meet somebody, as a child, you grew up where?
I grew up in the DC area.
Okay.
So DC, Maryland, Virginia, kind of bouncing around there.
As a child growing up in that area, did you always know you wanted to be involved in telling stories?
I always knew I wanted to be in the arts. And I think telling stories was definitely at the core of that, but it didn't kind of materialize as the nucleus of everything I was doing until much later. But I was always into writing, into theater, into performance, and all that.
And writing stories as well? Yeah,
definitely.
So how did it, it's interesting then, so that was kind of interest. How did it morph into what you're doing now?
So I did, like I said, theater growing up, and kind of fell in love with doing more of the behind the scenes producing type work. Really loved directing, really loved kind of getting behind and having all of the pieces come together. And eventually went to college originally for directing at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. And my second year there, they were shifting the directing major into kind of a broader stage management, applied theater arts. And so I hopped over to Temple University across town to finish a dual major in theater and film. This is definitely the long story short.
No, that's cool.
My film degree ended up sending me to Austin, Texas some years later, where I got a job with the Austin Film Festival and eventually worked my way into their creative director position. And the Austin Film Festival, I think, is where everything really started to gel for me, because the festival is known as the Writers' Festival, and it's unique from other film festivals in that it really celebrates the writer's role in film and what has come to be film, television, podcasting, I mean, any sort of narrative art. And this is where that idea of story being at the centerfold of all of these different mediums kind of came to mind. The light bulb went off, and I really saw this common denominator and this common universal language between artists and creatives. And to me, I saw that to be story. And what was interesting in especially planning the Austin Film Festival Screenwriters Conference was that story wasn't just in what we're expressing, but the stories that we're attracted to are a byproduct of our own personal narrative and our own personal mythology. And so then it just, once you start looking for something, just kind of like the laws of the universe, you see it everywhere. And so at that point, I saw a story everywhere, not only in the art and why we're attracted to it and where it comes from, but looking all the way back to childhood when I was making my brother and sister act out plays that I wrote that were just god awful.
So do you have a record of those stories anywhere, or were they ever taped?
Oh, yes. There are videotapes. I think that I might get asked to leave my family if those ever saw the light of day. And then
But
my dad has a whole filing cabinet of all of our stuff. So I imagine he has one or two of the original plays, but
I'll share an idea with you, which I've shared with other people, but this would be a great fundraiser for the story parlor. If you laugh, if everybody recreated, or you already have it, they showed their very first stories. And wouldn't that be cool, and not just you, but everybody else to recreate the very first thing. And you were lucky that it were taped, that they're somewhere. You just have
yeah,
to
right.
convert
Yeah.
them. So you grew up as a kid telling stories, and something you said caught my attention. You mentioned that, you've been a director as well. And I have the theory, Erin, that a lot of directors tell me this, they prefer directing to acting, performing. But the truth is they prefer it because they don't have to memorize, any dialogue that way. But isn't that cool though, about the difference between that and sort of what you do is storytelling, right? Isn't necessarily memorization, right? Or ideally it's not memorization, it's just telling a story from your heart or gut. Is there a difference there?
Oh, I think, in the story classes that I've taught and in my own storytelling experience, I think one of the least helpful things to do within that craft is to approach it as something that you memorize. I think the beauty in storytelling, and specifically as we're talking about that oral storytelling and that true to life storytelling, is telling it from the heart. And, that changes, that has a life force of its own, because as we evolve and change, our story hopefully evolves and change alongside of us, because our perspective is broadening and taking left turns and, on and on and on. And so I think we have to let it keep its legs, and memorization can cut those off pretty quick.
So what was the idea of the story, Paula? I love the name, but how'd that evolve or becoming into fruition?
So during my time at Austin Film Festival, I've always known that I wanted to have my own business. And it was there where really, when I started to see this idea of story and everything, I realized that what I wanted to do was to open up a space that celebrated that as a common denominator, celebrated this idea that not just oral storytelling, but the filmmakers and the theater artists and the comedians and the dancers and the poets and on and on and on, we're all telling a story. And also to bring them together, because in my particular experience in film and in theater, when I was in the theater world, it was the theater world together. And I didn't see a whole lot of that intermingling between artists or audiences for that matter. And so the idea of this space was to really kind of fuse artistic sensibilities, both in front of the stage and behind. And so the audiences and artists being exposed to stories hailing from all mediums. And so originally, when I was in Austin, I established an LLC under the name of Story Bar, and started to look for a space. And in the kind of background of all of that was planting seeds up until whenever the doors were open. And so what that looked like was mostly in the beginning hosting events wherever I could. And in Austin, that was everywhere from a farm out in the suburbs to Google Fiber downtown to speakeasies and restaurants and on and on. And in so doing, folks started coming up and saying, well, I want to take part in these events, which were similar to the Moth, for listeners who are familiar with that, where you have a theme and then you have a handful of storytellers sharing short stories according to that theme. But aside from just straight storytelling, that oral storytelling, we'd have a theme, and then we'd have a dancer and a short film and a one-act play, and on and on for the evening. And so folks started coming up saying, I really want to be part of this, but I've never written anything before, or I've never composed anything before. How do I do it? And so that was the beginning of my journey in really diving into how to kind of take these pieces of our lived experience, how to work through that within the creative process, which is quite delicate and intricate and involved, and put that all together. And so that was really kind of taking a magnifying glass to not only my own process and what I saw other people doing at these events, but then beginning to take classes, went through a few certifications for creativity coaching, and then started offering workshops there. And all along the way, kept trying to find a venue with no luck. You know, there were multiple attempts at that, and they just kind of all hit a brick wall. But that was the beginning of it.
So that was in Austin, right?
Yeah, that
So-
was an
So what got you then from Austin? And by the way, a lot of people tell me Austin, in a lot of respects, is very similar to Asheville. The vibe and the feeling.
I think old Austin, and
Okay.
maybe even old. I was there from like 2010 to 2020, and I think I caught like the tail end of that real like novelty, dusty bar floor music everywhere. Austin, it's become a big techie town, you know. But there's similarities, big art culture, lots of art, outdoor enthusiasts, food, beer, all that.
So what got you from Austin then to Asheville?
Well, had kids for one. And after we had our first son in the end of 2018. And that was also what coincided with me putting Story Bar and physical space on the shelf. Because, and this is the big difference between Story Bar and Story Parlor, is Story Bar's business model was a bar with art programming, you know, where every night here's theater night, here's film night, you know, on and on. And Story Parlor, though it might sound like a small difference, is programming with a bar, more like you would find in a theater space, for instance. So anyway, after my first kid, the last thing that I wanted to do was run a bar. And just after all of the headache of not being able to find a space and this vagabond initiative working, you know, that's what I was sticking with and I was happy with, and it was working within my new role as a mother. And then, of course, we know what happened when 2020 came along. And that before even that happened, we started talking about getting closer to our families who are all in the DC area. And so started looking for where we could land and start this next chapter, and looked for the most Pacific Northwesty town, you know, east of the Mississippi, and Asheville was it. So that's how we ended up in Asheville.
And you got to Asheville about when was it?
Beginning of 2020.
Okay, so you come to Asheville and you have this idea, I guess, in the back of your mind. You know, you'd done it sort of in one area, came to here. What brought it together in Asheville?
Yeah. You know, I think it's just one of those universal things. As soon as you stop trying, then the pieces come together. You know, I really had put it, you know, real deep back in the drawer, thinking, you know, this is just not the right time. And at that point I had, you know, through COVID in particular, a creativity coaching business that was doing well enough to kind of sustain everything. And I think what happened was I had my second son in the fall of 2021, and my husband and I went to West Asheville to go satisfy a breakfast taco itch that still hasn't been scratched. We left Austin, but Taco Billy comes pretty close. And so we were over at Taco Billy and we saw this beautiful building that, you know, I'd noticed before, but hadn't paid much thought to it, just, you know, next door. And it had these beautiful arched, you know, floor to ceiling windows, circa the 1920s, small wooden floors, you know, the original tin ceilings. And I think because, you know, we were on maternity and paternity leave, we just had this like extra expansive time to play the what if game. And we're like, what if this were Story Bar? and, soon realized, well, it can't be a bar, and let's figure out something else for this to be. And the room, when you walk in, it feels like this welcoming, greeting, like comfortable living room where you would gather around and share stories. And so that's where the name Parlor came from, because it kind of satisfies two things. One, the parlor in the traditional sense of what that room was for was a place for people to come together and be entertained, that entertainment room. But then also the root word of parlor is to speak. And so that's how Story Parlor kind of made its entrance. And so that was, like I said, the fall of 2021. And it was the antithesis to the experience in Austin of just trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. I mean, it was a call to a realtor, and it felt like, snap, we had keys in hand, the next month. And everything in comparison, of course, there was some hard work involved to get it off the ground, but it felt fairly effortless, all things considered.
Now, for the benefit of the folks who don't know Story Parlor, and again, I'll give you a compliment here. So I've been hearing a lot, I don't know where I'm hearing it, but, all of a sudden it's another venue in town, And so Story Parlor is located where?
We're at 227 Haywood Road, which is basically kind of the Haywood Road before Beecham's Curve as you're exiting the River Arts District in the South Side neighborhood going into West Asheville.
And so describe the facility. It's a venue that people can tell stories at or have story events. But there's also, is there food and beverage?
We have snacks, but not any. Yeah. But we do have a bar. We've got our beer and wine license. I would say half our menu has some fun non-alcoholic drinks. But I would describe us as a multidisciplinary or a narrative art space that's for the community and by the community. And so yes, we're a venue, but I am not programming the venue. I program one event a month. I teach one class a week, and everything else that comes through the space is envisioned, dreamed up, and programmed by other creatives in the community. And so we have everything from recurring classes, and all of this needs to be true to our mission of celebrating narrative arts, to kind of have a space. And then, along with classes, we have recurring monthly events. We just brought on this storyteller who graduated from the East Tennessee storytelling program named Corey Howard, who for his thesis created this show called The Campfire Ball. And the Campfire Ball basically creates a story with the audience there. And so he has a couple things to kind of piece it all together. And so that's going to be a recurring series starting next year. We have Tom Chalmers listen to this storytelling show.
Now I know where I've seen it, because I always see Tom's stuff advertised. Yeah. And so now I got the connection. Good guy though too. He's amazing.
Wonderful. Yeah, he's been just such a joy to work with and have in the space. And that series splits its time between Story Parlor and 35 Below over at ACT. And then we work with Speakeasy Improv. They do shows there a couple times a month. We do an all arts open mic on first Thursdays. And then we have some quarterly series like a classical guitar evening that's programmed by the Asheville Classical Guitar Society. Say that 5 times fast. We have Jazz Hybrid, which is from Sebastian Matthews. And that's an evening of poetry and jazz. And then at the end of the evening, if the spirit allows, a kind of improv between the poets and the jazz musicians. And then beyond these recurring series, we have people who say, I just want to put together this one-time music and comedy show. Or, on Friday, for instance, we have a poetry event, or they might be, we've had film screenings. I mean, you name it, as long as it is within the arts and it's telling a story, it has a home.
What's the occupancy approximately?
49 people. And so it's very intimate. We call ourselves a listening room. So it's not, the kind of space where you can wander in and carry on a conversation as somebody's performing. We really want that artist to be engaged with by the audience.
If somebody who's interested in giving me some ideas here to propose something to offer there, what do they do?
So on our website, we have an event proposal. So when you go to storyparloravl.com, 3 big buttons pop up. One is classes, one is events, one is community. If you go to community, there is the option for event proposals. And we have a couple qualifications. And as long as you fit within all of those, we usually just do a door split. And we give the bulk to the artist. We require that they pay anybody that is performing.
Very nice.
And then, the split that we have helps just cover our basic expenses. But at this point, we are completely volunteer run organization. And then beyond that event proposal, if somebody wanted to do something more like a private event, or if it doesn't fit within all of the criteria of the proposal, they're welcome to rent the space. And we still keep those rates, low with the artist in mind.
And again, if you can mention, you mentioned, I think the website was what?
Storyparloravl.com.
Okay. And so it's really cool. You mentioned that people can, I guess, propose lots of different stuff. So you mentioned, for example, that you're teaching a course there.
Yeah, I have 3 classes that I teach now 4 throughout the year. One is a creativity lab, and that is a 7-week exploration of the creative process and your specific blocks and resistances, and coming up with tools to work through those, all with the accompaniment of working on a creative project. The second is a story lab, and that's looking at how to excavate your own lived experience for creative bounty, however you might kind of extrapolate your stories and put them into a poem or a short play or whatever it might be. The third is a new one that I'm going to be teaching through the Great Smokies Writers Program starting in September. And it's a hybrid of those, and that's called Creativity and Personal Mythology. And then the fourth has been something I've been developing for a number of years now, and that's a creative facilitator training. And we are in week 13 out of 14 of the first cohort of that. And it is a deep dive training in how to serve as a creative facilitator for any medium. So if you want to teach, how to do mosaic artwork, or, one person is working on role-playing games and how that can help with writer's block. I mean, you name it. Just tools of how to approach a classroom, how to do so in a way that honors those delicate and intricate parts of the creative process, and honors finding the person's stories in the ways that serve them and the ways that don't, and how to input that into whatever creative medium they're facilitating. So that's new. That's something that will be offered once a year.
What about something else that I guess you hear too often, that when you talk about creativity, and some people will say, well, they're just not creative, and how do you respond to that when you hear that?
Well, I mean, I believe, and it's at the core of the Story Parlor mission, that everyone is creative and that we all have a story to tell. And really what Story Parlor does is it exists to bridge those two things together. I think when somebody says that they're not creative, that is the inner critic talking. That's one of the #1 blocks that we experience as creative people. And so what would I say to that? I would say that that's a very normal thing to say, and then start unpacking the reasons why that is believed to be true, and then start unpacking reasons why it's not true.
As you're talking, Erin, I'm reminded of me as a child, and how I remember very specifically my art background, I guess, was that in 5th grade, I was, in 5 years old, I was very artistic in drawing and painting, as you probably are going to have your boys do. But then I got an art teacher for the first time. I did something, or I forgot what it was, and she laughed at it. I never drew, or I never picked up a paintbrush or anything since. But it's amazing how we can really mess kids up if we don't encourage them.
Yeah, That's when we're talking about getting into the why we
Right.
think we're not creative, that is 99.9% of people's reason.
What
It's some
somebody
variation of the story you just told.
that
Someone
somebody
somewhere along the way that they trusted told them they weren't, and now they believe it. And I just got goosebumps because it's a really sad thing. Because you know, as well as I do, when we get to explore our creativity, there's this piece of us that becomes alive, that we get to really get to know ourselves in a way that transcends our current understanding, that transcends any languaging or reasoning or logic, you know, that we've surrounded ourselves in order to survive and belong. And yeah, I'm really sorry that that happened to you, and I'm really thrilled that you were able to navigate past it and
well,
become such a creative person.
off there, I'll tell you another story, a similar kind of story. But let me ask you this: the same token, do people come to you, Erin, and say they'd like to learn creativity, they'd like to be more creative? Do people come to you asking that?
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and what do you
That's
tell them?
well, sign up for the creativity lab. That's what we do in there. And you know, I think there's two main things, you know, that we do within that. You know, you don't have to sign up for the creativity lab at all. There's something nice about being in a group of people who are doing the same thing, and that accountability and some kind of tools and steps and hand holding and all that. But I think the biggest thing is just kind of building that awareness of what we're saying to ourselves, why we're saying it, and how we could possibly reframe whatever perspective we have in a way that's holding us back. I really think that mindset is at the centerfold of that pendulum on the creativity scale, right? And as soon as we can start having a healthy and positive relationship with our mindsets, kind of role to our creativity, I think that's where the door opens. I think the second piece is establishing some sort of regular practice. You know, people bring up Pavlov's dog all the time for a reason. You know, if we can kind of set up a couple of things to set ourselves up for success, we're more likely to have a success experience with our creativity. And again, that's the awareness piece. You know, what's holding us back, what's getting in the way, how can I chisel that down? Because at the end of the day, a lot of the things that are holding us back, if we're looking at them from a psychological standpoint, are all habits. We've said these negative things to ourselves so many times that that is now a habit, and it is a worldview, and it is a belief system. And so along with the awareness, I think the other piece is patience and compassion, because there's a lot of unraveling what's underneath, you know, the ocean layer of the iceberg that's below this kind of surface thinking. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a slow and steady life journey, but I think creative work is life work, and vice versa.
I love the title too, though. You call it the Creativity Lab. You know, just a great way to get people to give it a shot or something. What do you
Yeah.
see the story, Paula? Where do you see the story, Paula, going from here?
Yeah. So, you know, it was really interesting. Like I said, it wasn't part of the plan moving to Asheville to do this, at least not while I had two kids under 4 years old. And I had also, along the same kind of timeline of finding the building, had started my master's degree. And so the timing of it wasn't ideal. But what's happened as a result is this ironclad grip I had on the original version in Austin, which accounted for every hour and every square foot and every piece of programming. I had to let go of it. And that is what allowed the space to be a community space. Was it just had to be, in order to survive. And that has been the most incredible gift, to see just these beautiful and creative and inspired visions come through the door, and what it can do for the community at large, as far as weaving our narratives together and connecting us all that to say, to answer your question, where is this going? I'm keeping a light grip on that question, because as a community space that exists for and by the community, I have to have a stethoscope up to what it needs. And so in that vein, there's some ideas that I have, and, just continuing to polish what's already in process is obviously at the top of the list. But I think being responsive over being reactive, being welcoming, really offering up the platform for what the Asheville and Western North Carolina creative community needs is the priority.
What's really cool is that people then, what I'm hearing you say, just come in off the street, if you will, and have their ideas, and if it meets the criteria, they're in. And so how many people, by the way, have proposed stuff? Like, you have a whole group of people, Tom Chalmers and other people as well, who propose stuff. You have on board, how many different programs have you offered over the years? Approximately.
I had a minute to do all of the math when we kind of reached our 1-year anniversary. And at that point, which was in April, the end of April, we had over like 175 events
Wow.
at that point. And so, yeah, that was pretty exciting. Maybe it was closer to 150. Yeah, when you're thinking about, most of the weekdays that we have are dedicated to offering classes. And so those events are really just taking place on the weekends. So, yeah, I mean, pretty much every Thursday, Friday, Saturday, there's something happening in there that somebody else has dreamt up.
So if, again, to recap, if folks want to find out more about the Story Parlor, location and the website, if you would.
Yep. So we're located at 227 Haywood Road in West Asheville. And the website is www.storyparloravl.com.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for being my guest on this edition of the Blaine's World podcast. I'd also like to thank my producer, Cappy Tassetti. And hopefully, Erin, I'll bump into you actually in person sooner rather than later. Thanks again.
I love that. Thanks, Blaine.
Okay, that'd be great.